The principles underlying this encounter is really arises from how some Greek tragedies have been translated by people who don't read or know ancient Greek. Of course, ancient Greek is now a finite language because it's no longer spoken, but nevertheless there are parallels. And so the idea was that in order to get more people acquainted with the very large and very rich, needless to say, tradition of Arabic literature, which is really woefully ignored in this country, we would try and treat it in a sense as the way Greek is treated. I mean, there is no barrier to trying to read ancient Greek. People don't feel resistance to Medea in the way that they feel resistance perhaps to reading Khaldun, or they feel this is too strange, too remote. So and it's actually, we started very small, and it's become much more, it's been quite, and this is our second funding round, so from that point of view it's also been encouraged. And we are, yes, that's the kind of motives behind it. Yeah. And we've been very, very lucky to have wonderful writers in different media coming to address and work with the translations. Yasmine is her second visit, which is wonderful. Yasmine came in one of the earlier periods, earlier
last year
series, when she actually talked about the poems that read in Arabic, which she'd been translating with, or is translating with Robin Moja. And this was a wonderful insight into cooperative working translations of poetry, which is now back in her other role, which is that she's doing a full translation of the whole of the Arabian Nights from Arabic, which is not the Robert Irwin on her left, supervisor, the editor of the first major translation into English from the Arabic manuscript by Malcolm Lyons, isn't that correct? I mean, well, Burton claimed to have done it, but
there are lots of claims.
Yes. Anyway, so that was 2003.
I think so.
Yes. And so you edited that, and it's a splendid introduction, actually, to the whole, each of the 3 volumes. But Yasmine has taken it on, as far as we know, you are the first woman, which, of course, as you all know, is very appropriate, because these are stories told by women. So, and Yasmine has also just actually recently published Aladdin, which she did from French, because it's an orphan tale, there is no Arabic original. So that has actually come out already.
About a year ago.
Norton, who are going to do the full cycle. And that's what you're going to be speaking about today. Robert, his book on Ibn Khaldun is actually out in paperback from Princeton now. And you have a novel just out called My Life is Like a Fairy Tale, which is why it's here. and that has been published by the excellent Cyrillis Press, David. So over to you.
Translators of Beowulf, Proust, J.K. Rowling, or motor car manuals have it easy because they know what they're translating. The problem is different with the Arabian Nights, or more correctly, the 1001 Nights, since it's never been clear which stories properly belong to that story collection and which printed version or manuscript version of those stories it would be best to translate. A lot of different choices have been made, and some of them have been practically criminal. They've been really rather fraudulent choices, fraudulent translations. In general, it seems that one sees an evolution from a translation as being the job being to improve something barbarous by putting it into a more civilized language. Then one moves on to registering the exoticism, the primitivism, the pastness of what one's translating, so as to get how alien the original medieval Arab text was to our 19th or 18th or 19th century society, to more recent aim for transparency, though of course it's question begging what transparency is. The translations of the Arabian Nights, of course, begin with Antoine Galland, his translation into French, Mille et une Nuits, which was published in the years 1704 to 1717. The way for his translation had been prepared by various fairy tales collections, Perrault and D'Aulnoy, so there was a kind of market for entertaining and fantastic stories. But the thoroughly scholarly Galland, he was a very distinguished Orientalist for his time, saw his purpose, part of his purpose was to entertain, and I suppose his primary purpose was to entertain, particularly ladies at court, particularly members of the intellectual elite in Versailles and Paris, and he was clearly very successful in that. But he did also have a didactic aim. As he wrote in the his preface to the Nights, the tales give pleasure because of the wonders they contain, but they must also be pleasing because of the account they give of the manners and customs of the Eastern nations and the ceremonies of their religion, as well pagan as Mahometan, which are better described here than in any authors wrote of them or in the relations of travellers. So he regards the Arabian Nights not just as a guide to Arab life, but also to Indian and Mongol and even Chinese. It's the Orient. He took enormous liberties with his translation of various kinds. For a start, he added stories that weren't properly in the Arabian Nights. Famously the orphan stories, of which there are about 10, for which we don't have an obvious Arabic originals, but also Sinbad. Also his publisher lumped in some stories by another Orientalist, Petit de la Croix. So you've got a bit of a dog's dinner, and then he poshes it up. He and his generation took it for granted that a French translation would get rid of the barbarisms and be a great improvement on the original Arabic. They were doing a kind of favour to the Arabic in translating it. And he Frenchifies it. So you've got palaces that look rather like Versailles and gardens which are also a bit like Versailles or the Tuileries. Subsequently, Mohsin Mahdi, who produces a very scholarly edition of the oldest manuscript, the one which by sheer fluke Galland happened to pick on as if the core of his translation, a late 15th century manuscript in a French library. By fluke, that he found that one, which is much earlier than the other manuscripts that were floating around the Middle East. Mahdi went on to edit this. It's in the chronological list when he did that. And Mahdi was rather stern about Galland's translation, abandoning the generally lean structure and fast movement of the original in order to create a more prudish, sentimental, moralistic, romantic or glamorous atmosphere. He was apparently willing to pay a heavy price to make his nuit popular. All this, along with his frequently imperfect understanding or misunderstanding and misreading of the Arabic original and inexplicable omissions, reflects poorly on knowledge of the language he was trying to translate, acquaintance with the habits and customs of the Orientals he was trying to explain, and art as a storyteller. That's fair in a way, it's accurate, but it's also unfair, it's anachronistic. Galland was not surrounded by a great gang of Arabist scholars who could help him and he could correspond with. That Orientalist establishment didn't exist. The Index Islamicus, the Encyclopedia of Islam, the great Dozi's Dictionary and Lowndes Dictionary, they weren't there. And moreover, of course, Galland was aiming at a wide audience. Mohsin Mahdi's edition, perforce, was perforce strictly aimed at a scholarly edition. He's doing something completely different. So it's not terribly fair. But the Galland translation effectively held a monopoly, very near monopoly position for 2 centuries, not just in France, but also in England, Holland, Poland, Russia, and so forth. Even though there were rival translations produced, they didn't read so easily as Galland, or for that matter, the rather good Grub Street English translation of Galland. There are all sorts of translations which I daren't linger on, like the one produced from Habecht's thing and so on. But I will move straight on to Edward William Lane, who was famous for his Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, published in 1836. In the course of that book, he referred to the Arabian Nights as being a faithful picture of Arab life, apparently forgetting about the jinns, flying horses, cannibalistic ghouls, giant rooks, Amazon women, and so on. So he sees the Arabian Nights, when he comes to translate it, as a wonderful learned document. It's a kind of encyclopedia to instruct you what life is really like in 19th century Egypt. His translation was based on the Bulak edition, and maybe at some point in the afternoon we're going to be talking about the merits and demerits of the Bulak and Calcutta too, and so on. And it's very heavily laden with notes because it is so didactic. The style is somewhat biblical because I think practically the only book Lane had read in his life in English was the Bible. So there's a sort of mock biblical style which makes it hard going, but not as hard going as some of the translations that came after him. Edward Said claimed that Lane aimed his writings at his academic peers. This is demonstrably nonsense. Lane didn't have academic peers. He wasn't an academic. He'd started out as a lithographer, went out to Egypt because he was interested in ancient Egypt. His translation of the Nights was published by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which is a society which aimed at reaching a very wide and only just literate public. It's not aimed at any kind of academic elite. It's for the skilled working man and their families. Lane doesn't write for academics, and academics paid no attention to his translation. It wasn't reviewed in any of the sort of things like the Journal Asiatique or any kind of academic serious thing. It didn't sell well, and therefore Lane started to junk stories. So it's a very abridged edition. He says, oh, you don't need a translation of this story. It's rubbish, or it's too filthy, or whatever. And he doesn't note when he deletes things. I jump now to John Payne's translation. Payne translated from the much longer printed text known as Calcutta II, which is printed in 1839 to 42. All these editions and translations are listed on the handout I prepared. Payne's was a clever autodidactic gentleman, dilettante polyglot, who translated Rabelais, Cabanis, Villon, Bandello, Omar Khayyam, Heine, Hafiz al-Shiraz, and he liked to ride about on an omnibus sitting on the top, translating as a agreeable way of passing the time. And he was rather cultured and hung out with Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the Pre-Raphaelites. And I'm pretty clear that Mallarmé. Oh no, sorry, I'm jumping down there. Anyway, Payne's translation was begun in 1877. It was not published until 1882. Began to be published then. It's pretty fast for him to have done it. He learnt Arabic from a standing start, whoosh like that, and then sits down to translate the Arabic like a professional. Paulo Horta, in a fairly recent study of translators of the Arabian Nights, has raised doubts about what his translation is really based on. Clearly, Payne had enough Arabic to check what was going on, what page it was on, but it does look as though a lot of the time he was translating from earlier French and German translations. He's aiming at a select elite. It was published, it wasn't for general sale in W.H. Smith or anything. It was a sort of subscription society, which would have, though he was fairly careful about rendering the erotic scenes, he might have got into trouble with his translation of the erotic essay. He went for that. For a limited subscription audience, and a lot of people subscribed to it. He made a decent bit of money from it, and Richard Burton, the famous Richard Burton, lurking in the wings, spotted that Payne had made a lot of money from this. And Burton, from a standing start, does this very fast. I mean, Burton had some Arabic. He'd been out to Mecca and Medina disguised as a Persian-speaking Afghan. It's noticeable he didn't go out pretending to be an Arab of any kind. It's also noticeable he failed the East India Company exams in Arabic. And it's also noticeable, I did a lot of work on Burton when he was working as a consul in Damascus. Other consuls in Damascus went rushing around collecting manuscripts and getting enthused about Arabic literature. Burton is interested in all sorts of things in the Middle East, but literature he is not interested in. It's just suddenly when Payne's edition makes money, translation makes money, he thinks, oh, I must do this too. And off he goes. It's difficult to make a definitive assessment of Burton's translation, how accurate it is, because it's uncertain at any one point what he's translating from. Most of the time it's supposed to be Calcutta II, the most compendious of the editions of the Arabian Nights. I can't remember how many volumes Calcutta II is in, but anyway, Burton's translation of Calcutta II is 10 volumes, to which he adds another 7 subsequently, which cover the orphan stories from the Breslau manuscript and other miscellaneous stories. What he's translating is dodgy, not just because of which bit of Arabic he's relying on, but also it's pretty clear he's relying on John Payne's translation. There's the book collector Quentin Keynes, who's quoted in Fawn Brodie's biography of Burton. Mr. Quentin Keynes recently came into possession of a good many tales from the same Villon Society edition of Payne's Tales from the Arabic that Burton had consulted in translating some of the tales for his supplemental Nights. These heavily marked pages make clear that Burton did indeed use Payne's version, but that he checked it with the Arabic texts and made changes in the prose whenever he felt Payne to be inexact, which was often, particularly when he felt Payne to be blurring the essential vulgarity of the original. Burton is keen on getting the vulgarity. This is a work of popular literature. He's also keen in getting an alienation effect. This is an era when translations being made from Homer and from various medieval sources, which want to make you realize, no, the world this was produced in was not like the world we're living in. So use lots of strange vocabulary and lots of rather odd syntax. Now, in order to demonstrate the superiority of Burton's translation over Payne's and its independence from it, the biographer Vaughan M. Brodie compared a paragraph's worth from the first page of the two versions concerning Shah Zaman's unexpected return to the palace, at the end of which Brodie described Burton's version as more earthy, more dramatic. What she did not do was compare Burton's version with the original Arabic, as given in Calcutta 2, which is what I shall now do. But when the night was half spent, and note the archaic prose as we go along, he bethought him that he had forgotten in his palace somewhat which he should have brought with him, so he returned privily. Privily is Burton's edition, and entered his apartments where he found the queen. Queen is an addition, it's just Zawja, wife. His wife asleep in his own carpet bed. His own carpet bed is an addition. Embracing with both arms is an addition from Burton, a black cook. Cook is Burton's invention. The original has Abd Aswad, black slave. Of loathsome aspect and foul with kitchen grease and grime. Of loathsome aspect and foul with kitchen grease and grime is Burton's addition. When he saw this, the world waxed black before his sight, and he said, if such a case happens while I am yet within sight of the city, what will be the doings of this damned whore? Where Burton has whore, the text has woman. During my long absence at my brother's court, so he drew his scimitar, C-Y-M-I-T-A-R, archaic spelling, bah. And the Arabic is saif, which just means sword, not specifically scimitar. And cutting the two in 4 pieces with a single blow, the 2 in 4 pieces with a single blow is Burton again, left them on the carpet and returned presently to his camp without letting anyone know what had happened. Without letting anyone know what had happened is not in the Arabic, but it is in Payne. It's clear that Burton uses Payne a lot, and Payne doesn't mind for 2 reasons. First, I think for 2 reasons. First, Payne hero worshipped the man who discovered the source of the Nile, been to Mecca and Medina, the great swordsman and so on. And secondly, Payne was aware that his translation was a bit of a fraud too. So I guess there was a kind of silent pact between the 2 fraudsters. How am I doing? I don't know.
Doing great.
Okay. Lane's English had been ponderous and sub-biblical. Burton's was much worse. But George Luis Borges, in a famous, though it should be notorious essay, unreasonably praised Burton for having avoided the stylistic poverty of the Arabic original. How Borges knew that the Arabic original had stylistic poverty, I do not know, and written in a style less antiquated than Madras's version some 20 years later. I don't think so. If you look at the vocabulary that Burton's using, some of it's medieval, some of it's Tudor, some of it's even very early medieval, and also a fair bit of Victorian slang as well. I think the Lane and Burton translations did a lot of damage to the reputation of the Arabian Nights in the 19th century, which really only survives because of fairly decent adaptations of the Grub Street translation of Galland. But Burton uses words beheight, bragly, bulking, cooler, emprise, fain, gramsome, noisome, ravin, and so on. Madras's translation, I don't think I really need to discuss. This is perhaps a bit, a turn of the 19th, 20th century, published in the Revue Blanche. It's hard to know what he's translating is the problem. He first said he was translating Bulak, but when people pointed out there was lots of it that wasn't in Bulak, he said he had an unknown Tunisian manuscript, but subsequently people worked out that some of his stories were Hindustani and some of them were European, and so on. So it's, on the one hand, it's a fraud, it's academically worthless. On the other hand, it was an enormous literary success. It's like Ouyang. It's very Macpherson's Ouyang, which is a fraudulent piece of recreation of Gaelic folklore. Madras' translation reinvigorated the literary elite's interest. Jarry, Joyce, Gide, Proust, they loved it. So it does a lot to revive interest in the Arabian Nights, despite its somewhat fraudulent status. To get to the so far I've been talking about the story of the translation of the Arabian Nights as a kind of long story of disorganized criminal activity. This stops only really with N.O. Littmann, 1875 to 1958, a great expert on, travelled a lot in the Middle East, expert on folklore and folk tales of the Middle East. And he translated a mixture of Bulak and Calcutta, which got published 1921 to 8. And it's a 6-volume translation. He keeps his annotation down to the minimum, probably for economic reasons. The whole work is, the problem with the Arabian Nights is so bulky. Until the appearance of the Pleiad and Penguin translations, this was by far the most accurate of the great bulk of Arabian Nights stories ever to have appeared. According to the Arabian Nights Encyclopedia, excellent work of reference produced by Ulrich Martzolf and Richard van Leuven, according to the Arabian Nights Encyclopedia, Littmann produced an objective, technically almost perfect translation aiming to meet the requirements of both linguistics and philology. But Borges slated it because he thought it was too colourless, and I have been told by German readers it does seem a bit flat. Where are we going now? So I think now the last two things, Hussein Hadawi's translation of the Mohsin Mahdi edition of the 15th century manuscript is good, but of course it's only covering 60 stories because that's all there are in that original manuscript. It's good. I'm just beginning to have slight doubts that every now and again it elides the specificity of the original Arabic in the interests of readerliness, so that where there's in one of the scenes I've just been looking at this morning, there's a palm leaf basket, and it's left out because it's not seen as necessary, it's slowing down the story. And later on in the Hunchback cycle, there's a reference to an Ashrafi dinar, very interesting and important for anyone who's interested in the chronology of the Arabian Nights, because it means that this story was finally put together after the reign of Barsbay in the early 15th century Egypt. But it's just translated as dinar in Hadawi's translation. So one needs to check the Arabic if one really wants to do serious things to do with dating. Then finally, or almost finally, there's Malcolm Lyons' translation for Penguin, with which I was lightly associated. And the decision there was to take the Calcutta 2 edition of the Arabian Nights, which doubtless infuriated Mohsin Mahdi and some other people. And it's the editors, the Encyclopedia of the Arabian Nights, took the same decision, and Littmann basically took the same decision. The reason for taking Calcutta 2 is not because it's the best and oldest, but because it's the most compendious. It's got the most stories. Calcutta 2 draws on a manuscript brought from Egypt to India by Turner McCann, but it also draws on Breslau and on Bulak and sundry other sources. So you've got the full whack of the stories. And in general, yes, people who have translated from Calcutta 2 have also indulged the readership by going on to translate some of the stories that seem to exist only in French, like Ali Baba and Aladdin. So now I think I should conclude. Burton's translation into English was translated into German by a man called Grave in 1907, and it was given a literary flavour by a preface by the well-known Austrian writer Hugo von Hofmannsthal, very well known for his opera librettos. And Hofmannsthal wrote, "Here is a poem on which more than one person has worked, but it seems that it originated from one soul. It is a whole, it is a complete world, and what a world. Compared to this, Homer appears pale and artificial. Here one finds bright colours and profundity, a stunning fantasy and sharp practical wisdom. Here one finds endless adventures, dreams, aphorisms, jokes, indecencies, mysteries. Here the bawdiest spirituality and the most perfect sensuality are woven together. There is not one of our senses that is not roused from the outside and the inside. everything in us is revitalized and encouraged to enjoy.